Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Between Two Bots. We've taken a little bit of hiatus, but very excited today to be presenting another episode of Between Two Bots, the podcast where a couple of people who work in AI try to have a conversation without Claude or ChatGPT finishing their sentences. So I am Ahmed, your host here today, CEO of Accelirate. We're an intelligent process automation and agentic AI company. Um, uh, we we've been working in the AI space for quite a while, and one of our very close partners in business have been UiPath. Today, my guest is Joe Miles. Joe Miles is industry head for life sciences at UiPath. Uh, Joe's the person life sciences organizations call when they realize that their processes are held together by spit and glue. Spreadsheets and institutional memory. Uh, Joe. Welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
It's great to be here today, Ahmed. As you mentioned, I lead the life sciences team, so it's primarily the manufacturing area, but a little bit broader than that in some respects, getting into diagnostics and some of the CROs and some of the different organizations across life sciences. And our focus is really helping organizations drive leverage AI and really drive transformation from a process perspective across their enterprise. As you are well aware, as we're all well aware, it is an exciting time. It's a remarkable time within the industry, within the business context. I think in all my years of working, I don't think we've ever seen anything quite like what's been going on the last 3-4 years or so. But excited to be here and look forward to having today's conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, we both have enough white hair to claim that we've seen multiple transformations in the industry, and I think we all agree that things are moving faster than they ever have. Life sciences is a very interesting area, right? As opposed to banking, financial services, where you have a very specific type of product and you have a very specific type of business, and it looks like it has uniqueness in its own self. Life sciences also has a lot of uniqueness, but it also shares a lot of things with other businesses. For example, life sciences businesses could be a manufacturing business. A life sciences business could be almost very, very close to a provider where they have HIPAA requirements, where they have people coming in and they're doing drug testing or various other types of things. There are the usual supply chain type of things. So it's a very interesting industry where there's quite a bit of variation, yet there's a underlying sort of standards that need to be followed. We were talking about some of our solutions that we've been developing together, especially in the tissue plasma donation. For instance, I was very surprised as I was doing research. The U.S. supplies 70% of the world's plasma-derived medicines. The intake processes that supply donor eligibility, screening, things like that are still largely manual. A lot of the stuff here is still unstructured record, very short time windows, human reviewers who have to get these things right, large amounts of costs, opportunity costs for not getting in the right donors, real cost for getting in donors that may not satisfy the requirements. We're using tissue and plasma donor as tissue and plasma as our anchor for the conversation today, but we're going to let this conversation go where it needs to be, because this is a sort of a framework problem, not just a donor problem. Let's just start at the front door. Let's talk about for eligibility as a framework, the AI reasoning. So donor eligibility is a good example of the problem. Let's talk about tissue and plasma donation, for instance. They require AATB, FDA criteria, hundreds of them, to records that are often incomplete, unstructured, arriving from multiple sources. You might have 4 to 6 hours to make the call. You can't just say, okay, we'll take a look at it next week. When you talk about those type of use cases, where do you think the organizations are leaning towards? What are the sort of implications of AI being able to ingest and make sense of a lot of unstructured data from both sides, not just on the incoming side of the documentation that's coming in for a donor, but also the guidelines. They're not just if this, then that. They're sort of very verbose, long paragraphs of things that a regulator or a guiding agency tells you what to do. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing.
Well, there's lots to unpack with that, Ahmed.
Long spiel.
Yes, there's a lot in there, but let's kind of maybe break it down into different parts and so forth. So, I think plasma-derived therapies, PDTs, as they're sometimes referred to, are really no different, from an industry perspective. And a lot of the other products, they're certainly very targeted, they're very focused, and they have a very unique processes that are related to the creation of those therapies. At the end of the day, though, there's still a regulated industry, much like every other therapy and company is within the life science realm. And I think that's the one area that you have to look at a little bit differently than other industries, given that most life science companies are typically global. They have to deal with not only global regulatory, but they have regional variations of those global regulatory scenarios. And regardless, as we were describing earlier, as we live in this time of incredible disruption and incredible change, and the pace of change being so quick, from a regulatory perspective, whether you're EMA or whether you're FDA or whatever agency you are, you really don't look at the regulations any differently relative to any technology that's coming along. You still have the primary focus of any regulatory agencies to ensure patient safety and product quality. And you do that by applying, generally accepted principles over the last multiple decades, where regardless of the technology, you still have to be responsible with, and if we're talking about agents as being the latest, an agent has to be governed and it has to be secure and it has to be transparent, right? And agents have to be attributable and there has to be recorded in some type of audit trail, right? And an agency even have to build in human approval. So regardless of what the technology is changing, you're still held to the same, standards across all of that. Now, as you get more specifically into areas like plasma-derived therapies, which are very unique in their own regards, there's a multitude of different scenarios there in terms of how do you actually acquire the plasma. Well, most of that is done through donations. So you'll see across all different regions, donation centers and clinics where organizations are acquiring the plasma, the blood plasma, from which they then will extract the proteins to develop their drug based on donations, based on certainly incentivizing patients to come in and donate. And that's a unique process in its own world. So on the one hand, you have a very different, a manufacturing company now has clinics in the US or in Europe, and those clinics are responsible for acquiring those that plasma from which they then get their proteins, from which they then can develop their therapies. That's a very unique scenario if you think about core competencies of a manufacturing company now having much more of a clinic-based scenario. So they're not only dealing with their global manufacturing regulatory, but they're also dealing now with personal health information or personal identification. So PAI or PII, PHI or PII type of areas, which has a whole nother layer of privacy and regulatory compliance. So there's just a lot of complexity that's kind of inherent in that. And I think what we're seeing now from an agentic perspective, and why it was so exciting, I think for us, as we got started working with companies like CSL Behring very early on in the process, is their interest and really almost need to leverage something new, to bring some new dynamics to transform that patient experience from a donation perspective. And that AI was well suited for that, although this is very new. And when you're in a highly regulated area, that's a bit, that's a challenge to do that. But I give them credit in terms of maintaining those quality standards and all of the regulatory standards at the same time, really transforming that experience for that donation, because it's important that the patient, from a donation perspective, has a very efficient, and you're very cognizant of the time that the patient is giving you not only the blood plasma, but their time and their effort in order to provide that. And that's a very important distinction. And I give a lot of credit to the companies as they think about, it's not simply about productivity, it's about really improving that overall experience to make the donation process that much better, because that will in turn grow that donation base and help them with their efforts to acquire those proteins. So it's a very multifaceted kind of discussion at some level, but I think it's a fascinating area, and I think it's been exciting to work with companies in that context.
That's perfect. Look, I think we talked about how life sciences is a very complex and as you rightfully said, multifaceted sort of environment. Multiple regulatory agencies, multiple sort of PII, PHI, manufacturing, healthcare. Sort of, it's a mix of multiple things, and that's interesting. Like, you know, you've seen it. We've been in RPA for the longest time. Building on some of the stuff that you mentioned, right? The RPA could populate the field. What it couldn't do really was look at a physician's note or a social history or a lab result, all unstructured, all in different formats, and produce a traceable recommendation with criteria by criteria rationale, saying, hey, this guideline from the regulator says this, but this is why this donor is eligible or not eligible, so on and so forth. That reasoning capability is what makes this framework. You're really looking at a framework that gives you that capability. Can you talk a little bit about where this reasoning pattern is being used in your customer base? After you, I'll tell our listeners a little bit about where we're doing this as well. But I'd love to hear from you on what are the things that you've worked with your customers on where you're seeing this type of reasoning pattern show up.
Yes, it's a really good point, and I think Accelirate's well positioned to kind of talk about this in your own right, because you've been along for this ride as much as UiPath certainly. But over the years, we've seen the evolution of the technology that started with automation, which was much more productivity type focus. I think we all can recognize that, and it was very important in not only productivity but also just helping users automate mundane, rudimentary type of tasks and really try to improve. Let them work on other areas and let the technology kind of help with some of that. Obviously, when in late 2022, when ChatGPT and OpenAI kind of entered into the equation, obviously Gen AI really transformed it, and we've been on this ride ever since then. It now gives you the ability to do things that just really were not possible within an automation context. Having said that, though, I think it's important to remember that we now are looking at a world where it's a very much a collaboration, if you will, across those technologies, and that you're leveraging both agents and robots and humans in the context of that execution layer that you're describing. So on the one hand, Agentic AI and Gen AI and so forth can do some really remarkable things from a process perspective and from an autonomous decision-making perspective, and doing very, as opposed to the deterministic way of robots, a very non-deterministic approach from an agent. But the coordination of that and the execution, and that the agents, needing data from other systems and having robots going out and acquiring that data, bringing it back into that context, being able to review internal documentation, whether that be SOPs or even specific regulations that are written, to be able to have that contextual understanding of those processes and then be able to apply that. That is very transformational in our industry. We just have never seen that before. And as you think about whether it's cycle time reduction, whether it's ramp up of employees because of that learning curve of all of that documentation that you have to put to memory, that is really, I find that to be really fascinating in an industry which is just overloaded with documentation. You're now able to leverage that documentation in ways that you've never been able to do before. And so that is really exciting, I think, from both a productivity perspective, but also from a compliance perspective, and really driving better compliance, higher, improved quality in a more productive way that is quite transformational. And I think we're still trying to get down that path from a quality perspective. I think the quality teams are still struggling with that non-deterministic technology. But there's ways I think we're seeing that you can build in various types of validations to put them more at ease and to make them feel more comfortable, to be able to structure data, be able to structure content, so that the review process can be much simplified and much more precise than what they've had to do before with all of that manual acquisition of all that data and backup. And that there's a lot of drudgery and there's a lot of time in that, right? And time is money, as we know. Again, reducing those cycle times is critical. So it's again a very exciting time in that regard.
Look, I think that is very interesting that you mentioned, the ability to comb through all of this unstructured data. I think, and you mentioned, the quality issue. A lot of this stuff was really dependent upon who was doing it, the person sitting in the chair, and what their knowledge was, and what they knew, how they, what their experiences were, what their sort of knowledge base was, if you may. But what we're seeing, at least in some of the stuff that we're doing, is when humans do the process, they will say yay or nay, and not always have a very detailed description tying it back to a very specific criteria, a very specific reason, a very specific, they might write it down, but they won't say page number 182 of this particular guideline states this, and because we have done this in the past, we said this. And being able to provide that level of an audit trail, I think, is really interesting, that we can do now and present it to the folks with that relevant citation as well as the analysis. But I think one of the big things it comes up all the time, right? Human in the loop. Like, what does it actually need to look like for a medical director to genuinely trust the output, not just sign off from a compliance perspective? What does the workflow look like in practice? What are you seeing sort of from a audit trail compliance and governance requirements perspective for scenarios like this?
Well, that's kind of I think the question of the day almost at some level, right? It's been hanging out there for a while. So, I think we started to see agencies like FDA and EMA, they produce governance or guidance, I should say, early in 2025. You saw a lot of going out. I think the agencies themselves are trying to come to an understanding of what is perfect at some level, or even what is good, because they are trying to understand that there is clearly a better mousetrap that's now available. But yet we still go back to how do we ensure patient safety and product quality? And those are the two key tenets of things like GXP processes. And so I think that issue and I think what we've seen, what your teams have seen as well, you guys have done some great work in this space as well, is that non-deterministic element has to be fleshed out at some level. And how are you able to do that? And I think organizations are just starting to get comfortable with that. At the same time, I think organizations, and I encourage them, I think in many respects, to do this. You just don't want to maybe take the low-hanging fruit and do something that has very little, limited friction, and you can able to get the technology in, but it doesn't typically have much of an impact for the organization. And I think that's why, in many respects, we're seeing a lot of POCs not really go into production because, quite frankly, they're not really worth the money that you have to pay to do that, because there's no value there. And so there's a little bit of a dichotomy that organizations need to look at processes where they can drive value. At the same time, they're concerned about risk, but how do you mitigate some of that? And so I think from my perspective, and there was just recently a warning letter that was actually generated by FDA around the use of AI, the inappropriate use of AI. And it was because they were taking everything that AI did at face value, right? There was no double check. There was no human in the loop to review that. And I think there's a balance where I think the AI can be very, very effective and very good at things like structuring data, organizing data, going out and acquiring the data and pulling that data back in. So you don't have to have a person go out into your enterprise systems and look at your training record, your quality specifications, or whatever the operational context that it was in, or maybe even patient records for that matter. We can bring that data together. We can develop it and present it in a format that simply allows for a quality person to go through those and go through their checks one by one by one. But we're structuring the data, we're standardizing the approach, we're creating a bit of a audit ready, if you will, kind of reporting that allows for a much more productive scenario. So within the life science context, for example, we've been having a lot of conversations, a lot of discussions around and analysis around the batch release process within the pharmaceutical world. And the challenges that go into all of this data that comes together, where you have hundreds of pages, literally hundreds of pages of, in many respects, handwritten data. And how do we capture that? How do we structure that? We're not going to change that data. We're not going to change the manufacturing process, but we're going to provide a view into that data that allows a quality person to very systematically and very structure in a standardized way go through that data and be able to identify where there are anomalies, because the AI is telling them that potentially this person's training record was not, they had not had gone through their retraining. Their training had expired. So that person, needs to get retrained, and this person is not available to approve this particular process. So just trying to structure those based on, again, that acquiring of data, bringing that back, pulling that together, and having a bit of an audit ready type of presentation of the data, so that if they do have an audit by an FDA regulator, you can generate batch specific information that you could even actually query against that information, right? Using conversational agents, we can do natural language queries against the batch data that could actually even be captured on a log file, so that if they are audited, they could even say that your teams went in and they not only reviewed the data, but they actually queried against that data to go in further to make sure that they are ensuring product quality and patient safety. So I think it's a very exciting time in that regard.
Perfect. Look, I think we talk about it internally, and I sometimes feel like we're talking in our, you're preaching to the choir, but the governance and auditability, traceability, human in the loop aspects of the UiPath platform, we love that, right? So it actually provides us a platform that can enable all of that governance. Undertrail really isn't just a feature; it's a mechanism of trust, and it's the same mechanism whether you're clearing plasma donors or doing underwriting decisions on a loan. You kind of have to give the governance requirements always mandate traceability to a particular decision. You got into a little bit of the operational picture here, and I think that's where the scale starts to become real. A busy plasma center may be processing hundreds of donors a day. Each one needs an eligibility review. Once that eligibility review has been done, we're looking at some of our use cases where our customers are doing tissue stuff, and for tissue recovery, that 4 to 6 hour window is pretty critical. So where does Agentic sort of move the needle in real operational scenarios? Talk to us a little bit about, you mentioned CSL and some of the other customers where where the platform, both on the ability to execute on structured, rules-based, combined with this non-deterministic, sometimes conversational type systems that are really moving the needle in the operations. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we think about things like eligibility, we can apply that in a lot of different ways. We were talking earlier about blood plasma donations and eligibility relative to patients like that. But eligibility applies in a variety of different ways, right? So we think about it, your team has done a lot of work from a donor and tissue bank type of context, right? And the ability to recover biomedical materials that are used in further downstream kind of transplants and so forth. But eligibility could also apply to things like clinical trials as well, or even therapeutic scenarios where you're looking at personalized backgrounds based on the genomic backgrounds of individual patients and looking at the applicability of the eligibility of that relative to that background. But I think if we focus on things like the tissue bank scenario that your team has worked on, that's a very complex environment. You have, to your point, there's a potentially, in most cases, there's some type of time element that they have to make decisions on very quickly. You're talking about a very sensitive arena that, in the sense of, there is a recovery of individual biomedical materials. At the same time, there's a family on the other end of that that's gone through a terrible tragedy, and there's a sensitivity to how do they to deal with that, which is a very different element than maybe what we talk about from the operational side. But also too, that there's a level of complexity that if you compare that to blood plasma complexity, where they're looking at, when they interview a patient, they're maybe looking at their health condition, maybe medications they may be on. In this case, you're looking at hundreds of pages of documentation that are coming potentially from any donor, and that how do you then match characteristics, quality characteristics, against those donors to potential recipients of those materials, and how does that line up? And there's a lot of complexity in that, as your team is well aware, and where there's hundreds of characteristics and quality attributes that potentially could impact where and how and who would be an appropriate recipient of that material. And so, and then there's a whole nother set of regulatory requirements relative to that. So I think as you start to think about those common themes, though, is where AI is playing a really important role is helping reduce all of that complexity. Whether that be an influx of massive numbers of hundreds and hundreds of pages of documentation, hundreds and hundreds of pages of regulations and so forth. It's able to kind of digest all of that complexity, be able to put that into a format and a framework that allows whether that be a quality person, whether that be a medical person, or that be an operational person, to be able to understand how they digest that data, apply that data in their role, and simplify that. Now, to your point earlier, we still want to have a human in the loop to oversee that and make that final sign off and push that final button. We want to make sure that's still in place. But at the same time, we're using the AI as a very, very powerful tool of organizing, structuring and formatting a lot of that data, and in many cases, analyzing that data to present that human with information that allows them to make a decision in a very, much faster, much more effective, and much more accurate, format or kind of ability than what they had before.
Perfect. I think you mentioned some of the scenarios. We have very similar. You alluded to it, the tissue bank customer that we have. Again, and interestingly, we talked about the how do we make sure that the folks at the end of the day can trust the results, and we're spending a lot of time trying to ensure that we can compare the results produced by these new systems to results that they have produced, because these organizations have a wealth of sort of, if you made training data to say, hey, listen, these are all the scenarios that we have in the past, and these were the outcomes of it. These were eligible, these were not eligible, what reasons, so on and so forth. And we're now able to take some of those previous results and then compare outputs from the AI outputs and be able to say, hey, is this system at least just as good as humans were in making those decisions? Is the granularity of the decision making better than what it was when humans were doing it, or at least just as good? And then be able to provide that transparent result, and then work on improving it as we go along. So that's something that's really interesting. I think that the feedback loop that AI provides to be able to continually improve is also very interesting, because that that is always very qualitative, right? If you may, in a human operation, you may say, hey, I want to give this feedback back to all the folks, and it may not be immediately applied the day you give that feedback. People continue to work on memory and continue to work on what they know best. So that's really interesting. It's an exciting time for us, as you mentioned. Moving on, and we're being cognizant of time. This is a topic, I guess. I'm extremely passionate about automation and AI. You're extremely passionate about life sciences and the space. So we could talk probably for hours on this. But talking about the sort of quality and batch release, you mentioned once the donor's been taken in, whether it's plasma drug therapy or tissue allograft or the manufactured drug coming out of a trial, you're reconciling records across multiple systems, the MES, the QMS, the ERP, before anyone can sign off. We see that reconciliation is largely manual at a lot of these organizations. The QA reviewer may want to say, hey, what's the deviation status on this particular lot or something like that? Those are the type of systems that I think can be created, and that unlocks a true value for the quality team, not just in speed, but just how they actually do their job. Your thoughts on that, Joe?
No, that's, I think, a real area of opportunity, and it butts up against a lot of the regulations and makes people nervous in some respects. But I do think what we're finding is that there's such an opportunity for value, for improvements, that even the regulators are recognizing that there has to be a better way, and they want to work with the industry in order to get there. And I think if you think about whether it's a pharmaceutical manufacturing, whether it's a blood and tissue bank donation organization, there's a lot of well thought out and very widely adopted regulations that have been around for a long time, right? So we're not necessarily going to change that. What we're going to be able to do, though, is be able to use the AI in ways that allow us to digest a lot of data much more quickly and be able to compare that specifically to some of the different regs, or even different SOPs, standard operating procedures, relative to the individual organizations, and be able to process that and reduce cycle times. And so instead of spending weeks, definitely days, in some cases weeks, and even months in some respects, reviewing all of the data related to a batch or related to a patient, they're going to be able to process that. And in the patient context, they're not even able to really you can't spend weeks analyzing that data, because you've got a time element to that decisions have to be made in terms of what is going to, what's going to happen downstream. Otherwise, you're going to lose potential donor. So there's just, I think, we're seeing that on the one hand, we're looking at bringing a very powerful capability to bear. We have to do that in a way that is still compliant, that is still allows for, as I'm preaching here, product quality and patient safety, but to do it in a way that reduces those cycle times, that improves the overall quality and decision making, that allows to be able to capture the data in a more organized, standardized format that now can be rolled out more broadly. That's just going to make it easier on the employees, easier on the organizations to ensure compliance. Everyone's compliance is better for all of us, right? If we're all compliant, that's a good thing. But I do think that from what I'm hearing from industry too, is that regulators are looking for help, right? They want to hear what the industry wants to do. That's why they're putting out guidance, and they're working very collaboratively with the industry, because they recognize that there is a very powerful tool that is now available. But we want to do that. We want to use those tools in a very responsible, compliant, and safe manner to improve outcomes. At the end of the day, that's really what we're all here for, right? How do we improve outcomes with better drugs, better processes that result in just better health outcomes for patients? And that's what's really exciting about it, is we're already starting to see that impact. We are just beginning this journey, as you were describing too, like things like predictive, qualitative views of processes, and if I see something happening in a process, that tells me because 5 batches ago that batch went south because of that failure in that one metric. If we can start catching those earlier, that just makes the world a much better place. We'll hopefully eliminate that batch from having to be disposed of because it missed the quality spec or whatever, or the rework, or or whatever the negative was from there, and that just improves profitability and responsiveness and overall outcomes for the patients, as I was mentioning earlier.
Absolutely. I think I mean, there's one aspect of just quality itself and determining and producing a quality, if you may, product, right? And then when something goes wrong, detecting it, and that may really trigger a big recall to all the customers that you have provided that product to, and requirements of notifications and things like that, which can be fairly onerous. And I think as I said, there are it's a very complex environment, right? Which is sort of beset by sort of unstructured data all over the place, right? And now we have a technology that can make sense of unstructured data a little bit better, so that we can put them in our usual structured systems and get the reports and things like that. But I think you mentioned the regulator. I don't think the regulator is standing still as well. The commissioner directed in 2025 that all agency centers should integrate generative AI. The FDA commissioner sort of said that, and there are news of the FDA to sort of adopt generative AI in various areas as internal productivity tools, very much similar to what the life sciences companies on the outside are doing. So I think this will interestingly increase the awareness on the regulator themselves on what is reliable, what is not reliable, what is good use of AI, what is not good use of AI. I really appreciate when the regulators themselves start using the technology that the folks that they are regulating are using, so that they understand what the limitations are. So it's not just outside, hey, I don't use this, don't ever use this, and or looking at it from an angle of just skepticism and not having used it themselves. Look, I think what is clear in all of this, I think, is the organizations really need to think through paradigms and platforms that will enable this AI technology application to various sort of areas of their operation, whether that just be eligibility enrollment, quality and batch release, whatever that may be, and various organizations are in different places. I think what I got out of this was governance and trust are probably one of the biggest things that need to be there in order for people to trust and use these tools. What's your experience in where we are on that spectrum? Sort of in the beginning, it looked very cool that you do this thing, and you're like, wow, this is something that used to take a long time, or it's very complex and didn't expect an agent to do something like this. And then when you scale that, you might see some issues, you might not see issues. Where do you see your customers? And look, you joined UiPath, right? You're seeing what the platform is doing. Give us a little bit of thought of, in the last few minutes here, where customers are in that journey. Where are we seeing sort of, what are the big questions they're asking, and how are you sort of answering those questions?
Well, it continues to be an evolution, right? I think we're 3 years into this journey, from an AI perspective, and we're seeing organizations now. I think 2026 is definitely a year of. 2025 was a year of maybe more of a POC, where 2026 is really a year about how do we get it into production and how do we get something real. and organizations now are looking at all aspects of where AI can play, and you're starting to see that kind of break out, and you're even seeing the technology. I mean, it's changing every 3-4 months or so, whether that's much more industry or vertical specific LLMs to different use cases that are emerging in different ways, and as organizations are sharing. So I think there's a lot of activity going on, and I think the old adage of trust but verify is certainly a mantra for this time. Although I think trust is kind of maybe it's verify then maybe trust a little bit, maybe in that sequence, given we can't just let AI run rampant. That's not going to work for anyone at some level, right? So we need to make sure that when we are targeting AI, that we're doing it in a way that I go back to what I mentioned earlier, that it has to be governed and secure. It has to be attributable to an audit trail. It has to be reviewable. There has to be a human approval built in and an escalation where possible. Those tenets don't change, right? We still want to go back to those foundational elements. What is changing is how we're utilizing the technology and how we're improving those cycle times, which I think is also, I'm seeing an evolution of the customer base now where they're recognizing that we do need to look at more substantive process areas, which potentially can be perceived as higher risk, right? But without some of that risk, and I think risk is maybe a little bit of an overstatement, but maybe without some of that complexity, maybe a better way of phrasing that, we're not going to get the value that we would get if we're just taking a very low friction, easy scenario because we're trying to just learn how to use it. There's nothing wrong with that, and we want to continue to try and maybe do that. But if, in terms of where we're pointing our resources and really going forward, looking at transformational type of opportunities, because that's going to drive ROI, and I think that's what organizations are really looking for: is how do you drive ROI, and how do you do that, and how can we begin to create differentiation within our company, within our processes, and that differentiation will in turn drive the value for organizations. And I think that's been a major pivot, difference between 2025 and 2026, where organizations now are really looking at how do we make this operational, how do we drive value, how do we bring transformation to those processes, and they're also getting comfortable with the technology, right? And we know that. So exciting time from that perspective. Verify but trust maybe is kind of a mantra from this, and it's exciting to work with companies in that context. So.
Absolutely, I think I have never seen fail fast sort of adopted by folks as much as I'm seeing now. I think that's a combination of the investment that goes in to build some of these solutions. At least the proof of concepts or proof of values has gone down significantly. The ability to deploy some of these solutions very quickly at low risk has become better. So we're very excited about this. Joe Miles, industry head for life sciences at UiPath, thank you very much for having a conversation with me today. I really enjoyed this conversation, learned quite a bit. This is Ahmed Zaidi. This was Between Two Bots. In all transparency, the script was drafted by AI. The audit trail, however, is thorough. The irony remains fully intentional. We will see you next time. Joe, thank you very much for being on the show with me.
Thank you, Ahmed. Enjoy the conversation.
Have a great day.